Commander Blake Hart returned to his quiet hometown after many years of harsh missions, hoping for a calm life, but the moment he stepped off the bus he felt something strange in the air, a kind of silence that did not feel natural but heavy, like the whole town was holding its breath. People he once knew whispered in small groups, their eyes drifting toward the forest that bordered the town. The forest Blake had explored as a child, but now looked darker and older, as if it had been watching the town in return. Reports of strange noises, disappearing animals, and trees torn apart had reached the authorities, but no one gave any clear answers, and this bothered Blake more than he liked to admit. Early the next morning, before sunrise even touched the sky, he walked toward the forest with a small backpack, a lantern, and an old habit of staying alert. The moment he crossed the first line of trees, the air grew colder, and the usual sounds of insects and birds were missing, replaced by a deep quiet that felt unnatural. He moved slowly, watching the ground, noticing long claw marks scraping across rocks and patches of earth pushed aside as if something huge had dragged its weight through the soil. After an hour of steady walking, he stopped when he found something he never expected, a massive, cracked shell, half buried under roots and leaves, its surface smooth but glowing faintly in the dim light. It was the size of a small car, and the cracks along its curve pulsed like faint breaths. Blake crouched beside it, placing his hand on the cool surface, and the ground responded with a low vibration that traveled up his arm, making him jerk back in shock. The forest around him trembled slightly, leaves shaking though there was no wind, and a deep sound rose from beneath the earth, not a roar, not a growl, but something unfamiliar, something alive and waking. He stepped back slowly, keeping his body steady, and watched as the soil around the shell shifted like something moved under it. Blake reached for his scanner, a small military device he kept for emergencies, and pointed it toward the ground. The device blinked rapidly and flashed a warning he had never seen outside classified missions. Unknown life form detected, massive. His breath caught in his throat as the trembling grew stronger, and he felt the ground pulse like a heartbeat beneath his boots. Suddenly, a long crack shot through the earth, splitting a line across the clearing and releasing a warm, damp air that smelled like old stone and something ancient. Blake tried to step back farther, but the ground jumped beneath him, and he barely kept his balance. The shell in front of him shifted, rising slightly from the soil as if something below pushed it upward. Another crack echoed, louder now, and the forest seemed to flinch. The sound was no longer just below him. It came from deep tunnels running under the entire forest, as if something enormous had lived under the ground for years without anyone knowing. Blake lifted his lantern, the light shaking as his hand trembled for the first time in a long while. The clearing slowly filled with a soft, low humming sound, a rhythm he could not explain, as if the creature beneath was calling to something or remembering something. He thought about leaving, calling back up, warning the town, but his instincts told him that turning away now could be a mistake, that whatever was waking might react faster if it sensed fear or sudden movement. So he stayed still, breathing slowly, waiting for the next sign. Then the shell cracked fully, splitting down the middle, sending a sharp sound through the trees. From the shadow beneath, two faint glowing shapes appeared, eyes, large and unblinking, staring upward as if sensing light for the first time in years. Blake's heart beat hard in his chest as he realized he was not looking at an ordinary creature. This thing was intelligent, aware, and trying to adapt to the world above. The ground vibrated again, harder now, making small stones bounce around his boots. Blake took one careful step back, then another, keeping his eyes locked on the glowing ones rising from the dark. The creature let out a slow, deep hiss that rolled through the forest like distant thunder. Blake tightened his grip on the lantern and whispered to himself that whatever had been sleeping under this forest was awake now, and its awakening was only the beginning of something far bigger than the town, the forest, or anything he had faced before. Blake did not move for several long seconds as the glowing eyes rose higher from beneath the cracked shell, the creature lifting its head, slowly as if testing the air after years of darkness, and the forest around him stayed utterly still, almost frozen in fear. As its shape became clearer, Blake saw long, armored scales along its neck that reflected faint streaks of light from his lantern, each scale shifting like living metal. The creature's breath came out in slow waves of warm air that made the leaves around him tremble, and Blake felt a deep instinct inside him, something between caution and curiosity telling him that the creature was not acting wild but trying to understand its surroundings. The ground under his boots vibrated again, not as violently as before, but enough to remind him that whatever strength this creature held was far beyond anything he had faced in human combat. Blake took a careful step backward, steadying his breathing, but as he moved, the creature's head snapped in his direction, its glowing eyes fixed sharply on him, not with rage but with recognition, as if it sensed his presence clearly even in the dim light. Blake lifted both hands slowly, palms open, hoping to show he meant no harm, but his heart still pounded like a drum inside his chest. The creature watched him, its pupils narrowing and widening as if adjusting to the light. Then, with a slow movement, it pushed itself fully out of the ground, revealing a massive body covered in dark green plates shaped like natural armor, each segment shifting with a strange, smooth rhythm. Blake counted at least 4 long limbs, ending in sharp, curved claws that left deep grooves in the soil as it pulled itself forward. Instead of attacking, it stopped halfway out of the earth and raised its head toward the sky, letting out a low, resonant sound that echoed through the trees like a call or a signal. The birds burst from distant branches, scattering into the night, and Blake felt the sound inside his bones, a vibration that made him take another step back. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his small communication device, considering whether to warn the authorities, but something stopped him. The creature was calm, almost controlled, as if reacting to a memory rather than instinct. Blake whispered softly, "Easy. I'm not your enemy," hoping the creature might understand tone if not words. To his surprise, its gaze softened, the glow in its eyes dimming slightly. It lowered its head, sniffing the air around him, and Blake felt a faint rush of warm breath across his face. It wasn't attacking, it was studying him. Slowly, Blake lowered his hand toward his scanner again, wanting to gather more data without startling the creature, but before he could activate it, a sudden loud crack echoed from deeper in the forest. The creature reacted immediately, turning its head sharply toward the sound and narrowing its glowing eyes. Blake also froze, listening as the crack turned into a rumble-heavy footsteps far away but approaching. Something else was moving in the forest, something large enough to make the ground tremble again. Blake's instincts sharpened instantly. This was not normal wildlife. He looked at the creature, which growled softly, not at him but at the approaching sound, as if sensing a threat. Blake realized something unsettling. This creature had not awakened by accident. It had been awakened by fear of something else. The footsteps grew louder, closer, each one sending small shockwaves through the soil. Blake lowered himself slowly behind a fallen tree, keeping his eyes on the creature and the darkness beyond. The creature's scales shifted, flattening along its body in a defensive posture, and its breath grew slower, controlled, as if preparing for confrontation. Blake tried to peer through the shadows but saw nothing yet, only the faint shake of bushes and branches swaying with the weight of whatever moved through them. The creature stepped forward, finally pulling itself fully out of the ground, standing taller than Blake by several feet, and took a position between Blake and the approaching presence. Blake felt a strange rush of emotion. This creature, despite its size and strength, was protecting him. He gripped the lantern tightly, staying still, waiting for the moment when the second presence would finally reveal itself. The forest held its breath again, the tension building like a tightening rope, and Blake knew the next few seconds would change everything. As the rumbling footsteps reached the edge of the clearing, the creature let out a deep warning growl. Blake leaned forward, trying to see through the darkness, when suddenly 2 bright shapes appeared between the tree's glowing eyes. Not green like the creature beside him, but sharp, white, cold, and filled with something far more hostile. Blake felt the forest shift again as the second creature stepped into view, and he finally understood the truth. The reptile he had discovered was not the only thing that had awakened tonight. Blake's breath caught as the second creature stepped fully into the clearing, its tall frame weaving between the trees like a shadow come to life, its white glowing eyes fixed not on Blake, but on the reptile that stood protectively in front of him. Unlike the first creature whose scales looked natural and smooth, this new one had jagged armor that seemed almost broken in parts. as if it had survived battles deep underground, and every step it took made the air grow colder. Blake stayed behind the fallen tree, forcing himself to breathe quietly while studying both creatures, trying to understand their connection. The first creature, the one he had watched awaken moments ago, lowered its body, its tail sweeping in a slow arc across the ground, preparing for a confrontation. The hostile creature let out a sharp, metallic sound, something like a warning, and Blake realized the two beings were not equals but rivals, possibly enemies from a forgotten conflict beneath the earth. The first creature stepped forward, blocking Blake completely, and Blake felt a surprising sense of safety behind its massive presence, even though he barely understood what it was. The second creature sniffed the air, detecting Blake's scent, and its white eyes flicked toward him for a brief second, making Blake's heart thump hard. But the first creature growled, pulling the hostile one's attention back. A moment of stillness passed, heavy and tense, and then the hostile creature lunged. The first creature responded instantly, swinging its tail and striking the attacker across the chest, sending it crashing through a small tree. Blake ducked even lower behind the fallen log as branches flew in all directions. The two creatures circled each other, letting out deep, rumbling sounds that made the forest tremble. Blake considered running, but leaving the first creature alone in a battle felt wrong. He sensed an odd connection forming, something unspoken but powerful, something that told him this creature did not want harm to come to him. The hostile creature charged again, this time faster, and their bodies collided with a force that shook the ground. Blake watched as the first creature held its ground, using its heavier scales to absorb the impact, but the hostile creature slashed at its side, leaving a thin glowing wound that pulsed faintly. The first creature let out a pained roar, and Blake felt a surge of fear. He needed to help somehow, but he had no weapon strong enough to stop such beings. Suddenly, he remembered the scanner in his pocket, the device that had reacted strongly to the underground activity. Maybe it could trigger something. Blake pulled it out and powered it on, aiming it at the hostile creature. The scanner emitted a sharp pulse of blue light, and the hostile creature recoiled as if struck by something invisible. It staggered backward, shaking its head angrily, and Blake realized the pulse must have disrupted some kind of energy within it. The first creature seized the opening and lunged forward, knocking the hostile one to the ground. Blake held his scanner tightly, ready to activate it again, but the hostile creature recovered quickly and slammed its tail into the ground, creating a shockwave that threw both creatures apart. Blake shielded his face as dust and leaves flew everywhere. When the air cleared slightly, he saw the hostile creature preparing to attack again, its eyes glowing brighter than before, its body trembling with rising aggression. Blake pressed the scanner again, but it flickered. The battery was low. The hostile creature sensed his desperation and turned toward him, lowering its body in a stalking position. Blake's breath froze. The first creature, wounded but still strong, stepped in front of him again, growling louder than before, the sound vibrating through Blake's bones. Slowly, the reptile lifted its head and released a deep, humming call that echoed far into the forest, a signal Blake could feel more than hear. The hostile creature paused, confused, its eyes shifting left and right as if listening for something. Then, from somewhere deeper in the forest, another sound answered, a soft, distant reply, like an echo returning home. The hostile creature froze. The first creature raised its head higher, repeating the call with even more power, and the forest seemed to wake with the sound. Trees rustled, the ground vibrated lightly, and somewhere far away something responded again. The hostile creature took a step back, its earlier confidence fading as it realized it was outnumbered or soon would be. With a final growl, it retreated slowly into the shadows, its white eyes disappearing between the trees until the forest swallowed it completely. Blake let out a deep breath he didn't realize he had been holding. The first creature, still standing between him and the darkness, lowered its head slowly as if checking on him, its glowing eyes softer now. Blake stepped closer, his fear easing slightly, and whispered, "You saved my life." The creature blinked once, almost gently, and in that moment Blake understood that this creature was not just awakened, it was remembering him, recognizing something from a distant past he had yet to uncover. Blake stayed close to the creature, still breathing hard from the fear of the hostile beast, and as the forest slowly settled into silence again, He realized the first creature's soft blinking was not just recognition but a quiet attempt to reassure him, a gesture that felt strangely familiar, though Blake had no memory of ever knowing such a being before. The creature lowered itself slightly, its tail curling around one side of the clearing as if forming a protective barrier, and Blake noticed the glowing wound on its side pulsing faintly, the light rising and falling like a heartbeat. Without thinking, he stepped forward, examining the injury more closely, and the creature allowed him, lowering its head as if trusting him completely. Blake's hands shook a little as he checked the wound. The glow did not look like blood but energy leaking out, something that reminded him of old classified research he once heard whispers about. During his early training projects involving enhanced biological units designed to adapt and survive in extreme conditions. His mind tried to piece together half-forgotten memories, but the pieces were blurry, like a dream fading when one tries too hard to recall it. The creature watched him quietly, its breath steady, and Blake realized if he did nothing, the energy leak might weaken it further. He searched his backpack for anything useful and found a compact emergency patch, a flexible seal designed for deep cuts in hazardous environments. He pressed it gently onto the wound, and to his surprise, the glowing energy slowed, then stabilized under the patch's surface. The creature let out a low hum, softer this time, a sound Blake felt deep in his chest, almost like gratitude. Before he could step back, distant footsteps echoed in the forest lighter than the hostile creatures, but fast, too fast to belong to any human. Blake tightened his grip on his lantern, but the creature nudged him softly with its head, urging him to stay behind it. The forest grew tense again. Branches shook, leaves rustled, and a faint light flickered between the trees. Blake strained his eyes, trying to see who or what approached, but the light kept darting between the trunks, always disappearing before he could catch its shape. The creature beside him growled softly, not in fear but in warning, and Blake felt the air shift, the atmosphere turning heavy as the presence drew closer. Suddenly, a figure stepped out of the shadows, a woman. Holding a glowing tablet and a small transmitter, her lab coat torn, her breathing uneven but determined. Blake blinked in shock as he recognized her, Dr. Ilara Miles, a scientist who had vanished years ago after a classified mission. Ilara stared at the creature, then at Blake, all color draining from her face as she whispered, "You found it." Blake stepped forward, confused but alert, and asked, "What is this thing, Ilara, and why does it seem to know me?" Ilara held the glowing tablet tightly, her voice shaking not from fear, but urgency. "Because," she said softly, "you were part of its early training. You just don't remember." Blake felt the world freeze for a moment. He searched her face for answers, but she stepped closer, keeping a cautious distance from the creature. "Years ago," she continued, "you worked with the original research team. We created adaptive rescue organisms creatures meant to protect, not harm. This one was the prototype. It bonded with you." Blake shook his head, trying to process her words. "But the project was cancelled. Everything was destroyed." Ilara looked down, guilt flickering in her eyes. "Not everything. One escaped during the shutdown. For years it survived underground. Until something disturbed it." Blake felt a chill move down his spine. "The other creature," he said quietly. Ilara nodded slowly. "That thing wasn't part of the project. It's something older. Something that was here long before our research. Your creature spent years hiding from it." Blake looked at the reptile beside him, suddenly understanding its earlier fear and its protective behavior. The creature turned its head slightly, as if listening to their conversation even without understanding the words. Ilara glanced around nervously. "We can't stay here. The hostile one isn't gone. It's regrouping, maybe calling others. And if more of those things wake up—" She didn't finish her sentence. Blake felt the weight of her words. He knew staying was dangerous, but he also couldn't abandon the creature that had saved him. Before he could decide their next move, the ground beneath them trembled again, this time in a slow, rhythmic pattern, like multiple heavy steps approaching from different directions. Ilara's eyes widened in fear. "It's not alone." Blake stood tall, gripping his lantern as the first creature positioned itself once again in front of him and Ilara, ready to defend them both. For the first time, Blake felt not just fear but determination, whatever was coming next. He would face it alongside the creature that once trusted him long ago and still trusted him now. The ground shook again in slow, heavy waves as Blake stood beside the creature lantern, trembling in his hand, while Ilara tightened her grip on the glowing tablet, her breath turning sharp with fear, and the forest around them grew darker as if the shadows themselves were gathering for what was coming. The creature lowered its body, placing itself between them and the approaching threat, its glowing scales brightening as if preparing for a final stand. Blake could feel his heart pounding, but he also felt something new and unexpected calm rising inside him, the calm he used to feel during missions when he knew people depended on him. The forest trembled once more, and from between the tall trees, three shapes emerged, their eyes glowing bright white like the hostile creature from before. These newcomers were smaller but faster, their movements sharp and coordinated, almost military in precision, and they spread out in a wide formation, circling Blake, Ilara, and the guardian creature. The guardian released a deep rumble, stepping forward with slow confidence, ready to protect them both. The hostile trio began closing in, their breaths sharp and cold, and Blake felt the air tighten around him as if the forest itself was bracing for the first strike. Ilara tried to activate her transmitter, hoping to send a distress signal, but before she could press the button, one of the creatures lunged. The guardian reacted instantly, slamming its tail into the ground and sending a shockwave that knocked the attacker aside. The other two creatures charged from opposite directions, their claws tearing through the soil, but the guardian blocked them with its armored body, growling fiercely. Blake watched in awe as the guardian fought alone, taking hits, sliding back, but never letting the hostile creatures reach him or Ilara. Still, he knew the guardian could not defeat all of them without help, especially with its earlier wounds still glowing under the emergency patch. Blake looked down at his scanner, its battery nearly dead, but he realized something. The device didn't need full power to emit a disruptive pulse. Even a weak one might confuse the hostile creatures long enough to give the guardian an advantage. He raised the scanner, aimed at the nearest hostile creature, and pressed the button. A faint pulse flickered out, much weaker than before, but enough to make the creature jerk its head and stumble. The guardian seized the moment, striking the creature with its tail and sending it crashing into a tree. The remaining two turned toward Blake now, sensing the source of the interference, and both started advancing on him with fast, predatory steps. Ilara grabbed Blake's arm, dragging him backward, but the creatures were too close, their glowing eyes locked onto him. Before they could reach him, the guardian moved with surprising speed, placing its entire body between Blake and the attackers, taking a direct blow to its shoulder but keeping its stance. Blake's breath caught as he saw the guardian stumble slightly, the glowing wound brightening again as if reacting to the impact. Fear tightened in his chest. "You can't fall," he whispered, his voice shaking, and the creature turned its head for the briefest moment, its eyes meeting his with something that felt like understanding trust and a silent promise that it would not let anything happen to him. The hostile creatures regrouped, preparing for another attack, their bodies lowering as if coordinating silently. Ilara stepped forward with the tablet, her fingers tapping rapidly across its screen. "Blake," she said urgently, "the guardian responds to frequencies. I can amplify its natural energy, boost its strength temporarily, but you need to hold the attackers off for a few seconds." Blake stared at her, then at the hostile creatures, then nodded without hesitation. He grabbed a fallen branch, not as a real weapon but as a distraction, and stepped into the open, shouting to draw their attention. The creatures immediately redirected their focus toward him, their eyes narrowing. Ilara hit a command on the tablet, and the guardian's scales began glowing brighter, spreading from the wound to its entire body like flowing light. The hostile creatures lunged at Blake in unison, but before they could reach him, the guardian released a powerful roar louder and deeper than anything it had done before. A wave of energy burst outward, pushing Blake back but knocking the hostile creatures completely off their feet. Trees shook, leaves scattered into the air, and the hostile trio scrambled, dazed and disoriented. The guardian charged forward with renewed strength, striking each one with precise, powerful blows. One fell into a ravine, another fled into the forest limping, and the last, the strongest, tried one final attack but was met with the guardian's full force, sending it crashing into the trees before going still. The forest fell silent again, the trembling earth slowly settling. Blake stood frozen, breathing heavily, watching as the Guardian's glow softened and dimmed back to its normal faint brightness. The creature turned toward him, lowering its head gently, and Blake placed a hand on its scales, feeling warmth and life beneath them. Ilara stepped closer, relief washing over her face. "It remembered you," she whispered, "all these years. It never forgot." Blake felt a tightness in his chest, not fear, but something like purpose, something he had been missing for a long time. The Guardian hummed softly, nudging his hand with quiet affection. Ilara glanced toward the dark forest. "More disturbances will come," she said. "The hostile ones won't stop. They were never meant to share this land." Blake nodded slowly, looking at the Guardian with steady determination. "Then we won't let them take it," he said. "Not while we're here." The Guardian lifted its head toward the sky, releasing a calm, powerful call that echoed across the forest, not a warning but a promise that Blake Hart and his Guardian were ready for whatever came next.